Every summer, I go camping with my dad. It's a tradition he's followed his entire life, and recently, I've started enjoying it too. I'm 16 now, and last year, we embarked on our annual camping trip together. This time, we found the campsite online while searching for a new spot to explore. The site had no photos, but the map seemed straightforward, and the trail was described as easy and quiet. Just what we were looking for. On a Friday morning, we packed up and set out. We parked along the roadside and began walking down the trail. After just a quarter mile, it became obvious that the description wasn't entirely accurate. The path was muddy, tangled with overgrowth, and far from easy. Still, since we'd already made it that far, we decided to press on. After trudging through the challenging terrain for nearly 2 hours, we finally reached the campsite. To our disappointment, the area looked no different from the rest of the forest we'd been walking through. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction, and the only clearing was an overgrown patch of grass, barely suitable for pitching our tent. There were no scenic views or anything remarkable to make up for the trek. Nevertheless, we set up our tent and had lunch. My dad loves to talk, so the rest of the afternoon was spent in conversation. As the sun dipped lower, we decided to gather some dry sticks from the nearby woods to build a fire. While we were chatting and collecting wood, a sudden, loud voice interrupted us from somewhere behind. Startled, we both fell silent and turned around to look. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and chirping birds, suddenly went eerily quiet. There was no sign of anyone nearby, but the voice had sounded close, maybe about a mile away. We stood frozen in place, neither of us daring to speak for what felt like 30 long seconds. I glanced at my dad, whose face was a mix of worry and indecision. Without a word, he turned me around and hurried us back to the campsite. As soon as we arrived, he quickly got a fire going, but the screams didn't stop. Finally, unable to contain my anxiety, I asked, "Shouldn't we do something to help them?" My dad's expression tightened as he weighed his options. After a tense pause, he crouched slightly to face me and said firmly, "Stay here by the fire. Don't leave, no matter what. If you see anyone, don't let them get close to you." His tone made it clear this wasn't up for debate. I nodded, my chest tight with unease. My dad then took off, jogging toward the direction of the voice. I watched him until the forest swallowed him, and he was no longer in sight. Sitting alone by the fire, I couldn't help but imagine how I'd handle such a situation if I were in his shoes. Ignoring someone's desperate cries for help would weigh heavily on my conscience. Yet, being deep in the woods meant that any misstep could lead to danger for both of us. Minutes ticked by, and the longer he was gone, the more the knot in my stomach tightened. The sun seemed to sink faster now, and shadows stretched out ominously across the forest floor. Suddenly, the screaming stopped. A suffocating silence blanketed the woods. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound. Had my dad reached the person in time? Was he helping them? Or had something worse happened? The eerie quiet stretched into 10 more minutes, and my dad still hadn't returned. Darkness began creeping over the forest, making the trees seem taller and more menacing. Anxiety clawed at me, and I couldn't sit still any longer. Standing up, I decided to venture toward the path my dad had taken. I called his name softly, not wanting to disturb the unsettling stillness, but hoping he might hear me. There was no response. I moved a little further into the trees, feeling a cold weight settle in my chest. Then, faintly, I heard footsteps up ahead, relief mixed with fear as the sound of those steps grew louder. I still couldn't see anything, but my instinct screamed that something felt off, deeply unsettling. Each step grew closer and closer, echoing unnaturally in the still air. My body tensed, and just as I thought whoever it was would finally step into view, a voice called out. But it came from my left. From the left, I heard someone call my name. It was my dad, sprinting toward me with a panicked expression, shouting for me to head back to the campsite. The urgency in his voice sent a chill through me, and I didn't hesitate. I bolted back to where the fire was, with my dad close behind. The moment we reached the campsite, he grabbed his backpack and began shoving essentials into it as fast as he could. The look on his face is something I'll never forget. It wasn't just worry. It was raw fear mixed with a kind of despair that made my stomach turn. Without saying a word, he left the tent behind and we ran. It wasn't the usual brisk walk we'd done earlier. It was an all-out sprint back to the car. The silence in the car on the way home was suffocating. My mind was racing with questions I couldn't keep to myself. What happened? Who was that man? Why was he screaming? I blurted out. My dad kept his eyes on the road and didn't say a single word. Even now, he refuses to talk about it. Every time I tried to bring up that day, his whole demeanor changes. His face goes blank, and he looks like he's been transported back to a place he never wants to revisit. Eventually, I stopped asking. Still, I can't shake the memory of those footsteps approaching me that night, or the sickening thought of what might have happened if my dad hadn't arrived when he did. Years later, I found myself camping again, this time with two of my college friends. I'll use fake names for their privacy. Let's call them Ryan and Jamie. Ryan and I weren't exactly skilled in outdoor survival, but Jamie was the expert among us. He knew a secluded spot by the river that he wanted to show us. The hike to the site took us a couple of miles through the woods, but when we arrived, the area was perfect. A wide open field stretched out right at the edge of the river, flanked by dense trees on one side. It was quiet, and we had the entire place to ourselves. We pitched our tents in the middle of the field, right between the woods and the river. With everything set up, we cracked open some beers and settled around the campfire, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. As the evening wore on, I caught sight of movement near the tree line. Squinting, I realized there were people standing there. From their appearance, they seemed like hunters, dressed in dirty, weathered clothes that blended with the forest. They carried backpacks and moved as if they were trying to blend into the forest, but I didn't notice any rifles. Maybe they were just too far away for me to see clearly. I pointed them out to Ryan and Jamie, and while Ryan shrugged it off, Jamie's expression darkened with concern. "Hunting's not allowed in these woods," Jamie said firmly, his voice tinged with unease. "And it's not even hunting season." Ryan laughed, brushing off Jamie's concern. "Maybe they're just hikers, or maybe poachers," he joked, clearly trying to lighten the mood. We eventually shifted our focus back to our casual conversation, though Jamie seemed distracted, occasionally glancing toward the tree line. Hours passed, and the night settled in fully. Exhaustion from the long day finally hit us, and we agreed to call it a night. The sun had long disappeared, leaving the campsite blanketed in darkness. As we crawled into our tents, the fatigue quickly reminded me how unaccustomed I was to camping. The thin blow-up mattress and the small, enclosed space of the tent made it almost impossible for me to relax. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, probably 2 hours, tossing and turning, hoping I could at least catch a few hours of sleep. But just as I started drifting off, a sound jolted me awake. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be Ryan or Jamie heading back from the woods after a late-night bathroom trip, but something felt off. I hadn't heard anyone unzip their tent or leave. The footsteps were growing louder, and before I could convince myself it was one of them, I realized there was more than one set of steps. 2, no, 3, maybe even more. The soft crunching of grass and twigs grew closer, forming a deliberate, almost synchronized rhythm. My heart raced as I stared at the thin fabric of my tent, expecting to see the glow of flashlights moving toward us. But there was nothing, no lights, no explanation for why they'd be walking through the field so silently. They had to know we were here. Our tents were smack in the middle of an open field. No one could miss them. So why would anyone, let alone a group, pass by like this without acknowledging us? It didn't make sense. Fear froze me in place. I decided my best option was to stay still and pretend to be asleep, Holding my breath, I listened intently as the footsteps drew nearer. The sound was so close now that it felt like they were just feet away, walking in a line right past our tents. The moment they seemed far enough, I quietly unzipped my tent, taking care not to make a sound. I peeked out into the night, my pulse pounding in my ears. Just as I craned my neck to see better, something caught my attention. His wide eyes met mine, reflecting the same alarm I was feeling. Without saying a word, we both turned our heads toward the retreating figures. They were faintly visible in the darkness, but still moving away, their silhouettes blending eerily into the shadows. I carefully slipped out of my tent and hurried over to Jamie's. Kneeling by the flap, I unzipped it and shook him awake. As Ryan and I quickly explained what we'd seen, Jamie's expression shifted from sleepy confusion to sheer horror. It was clear this wasn't something he'd encountered before, and for someone as experienced in camping as he was, that made it even more unsettling. "We need to pack up and get out of here," Jamie said, his voice trembling as he threw on his jacket. None of us argued. The unease was too thick to ignore. We scrambled to gather our gear, fumbling with our bags in the dim light. Just as I was zipping up my backpack, Jamie's voice broke the tense silence. "Guys, hurry up," he whispered urgently. I froze, my stomach dropping at the terror in his tone. Looking up, I followed his gaze to the tree line. My heart stopped. The group, now clearly 5 or 6 people, was standing at the edge of the woods, motionless, watching us. Adrenaline surged through my veins. There was no time to think. I shoved the last of my things into my bag and swung it onto my back. Without a word, the 3 of us broke into a sprint, heading straight for the trail that led back to the parking area. We left our flashlights off, relying on the faint outlines of the path and the dim starlight to guide us. The darkness was disorienting, and the sound of our hurried footsteps and labored breathing filled the air. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figures following us, but the shadows behind us remained still. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the parking lot. Our cars came into view, and a wave of relief washed over me. We didn't slow down until we were inside the vehicle, locking the doors and catching our breath. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that those people weren't just out there by coincidence. The way they moved, the way they watched us, it felt deliberate, like they want us to know they were there. Whatever their intentions were, I'm just grateful we didn't stick around to find out. There aren't too many people who venture out to camp in the same remote spot as I do, especially during the off-season. That's why I was surprised to see someone already there when I arrived. A tent had been pitched near the lake, and its owner was walking along the shoreline. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a pair of faded swim shorts and a stained white t-shirt. I decided to set up my tent a little further down from where his was, putting some distance between us. After setting up, I gathered some large rocks from the surrounding area and arranged them into a circle to prep for the campfire I planned to light later. As I worked, I noticed a man standing by the lake. At first, I thought nothing of it, but the longer I looked, the more unsettling it became. He wasn't just glancing in my direction. His entire body was turned toward me, and he was staring directly at me. I tried to shrug it off and focus on my task, but every time I glanced back, there he was, frozen in the same position, his gaze locked on me. My discomfort grew until I decided to break the tension by waving at him. Maybe he was just being friendly, but too shy to approach. My wave didn't have the effect I'd hoped for. Without acknowledging me, he turned away and continued walking along the shoreline, as though nothing had happened. The whole interaction left me uneasy, an inexplicable sense of dread creeping in. I made a mental note to keep an eye on him. For the next 20 minutes or so, he wandered the area near his tent before finally disappearing into the woods behind it. I figured there might be a trail back there, or maybe he was just exploring. Either way, I was relieved to have some space to myself. With the lake now quiet, I set up a folding chair near the water and allowed myself to relax. The serenity of the surroundings helped me shake off the weird encounter, and I spent about an hour enjoying the view. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I decided it was time to head back to my tent. I moved my chair and set it near the campfire ring I prepared earlier. Once the fire was lit, its warm glow spread across the small clearing, making the shadows of the trees around me seem even darker. While sitting there, taking in the peaceful forest, something in the distance caught my eye. Near the base of a tree far off in the woods, I noticed a vague shape. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, it was difficult to tell, but then I saw it, a flash of white, like a shirt. My stomach sank as I realized it was him. The man, he was standing motionless, partially hidden by the tree, watching me from the shadows. But now he was standing in the woods, staring directly at me. How long had he been there, watching? A chill ran down my spine as I realized I had no way of knowing. I repositioned my chair to the opposite side of the campfire, making sure I could keep an eye on him without turning my back. From this vantage point, I sat facing the dark silhouette of his figure in the forest, my nerves on edge. He didn't move, just stood there, partially hidden among the trees, watching. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as he remained rooted in place, his presence looming like a shadow over my campsite. Eventually, the fading light of dusk made it harder to see him. The thickening darkness blurred his outline until it vanished completely into the growing shadows of the forest. My campfire still illuminated my little clearing, casting dancing light onto the surrounding trees, but it also left me exposed. I knew he was still out there, watching me from the shadows, unseen but all too aware of where I was. My anxiety was spiraling. Why was he doing this? What did he want? The strange thing was, despite having a tent set up, he never once returned to it. Not since I'd arrived. I wrestled with the idea of packing up and leaving, but a more terrifying thought stopped me. What if he followed me, out here in the middle of nowhere? I couldn't risk being chased or ambushed on the trail back to my car. So, I stayed put, forcing myself to keep the fire burning and my eyes wide open. The hours dragged on, and the only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the whispering wind through the trees. My exhaustion was overwhelming, but I didn't dare let my guard down. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the forest, a wave of relief swept over me. I scanned the area in every direction, but the man was nowhere to be seen. It was like he'd vanished along with the night. Not wasting another second, I hurriedly packed up my gear, my hands trembling as I worked. Once everything was stowed, I all but sprinted down the trail, my heart pounding until I finally reached my car. Even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him emerging from the woods. I still don't know what that man's intentions were. Maybe he was just some weirdo, or maybe he had something far worse in mind. All I know is, if I hadn't stayed awake and kept my guard up, I might not have made it back.